Hi, Misha here, and we recently started looking at British tanks. And I started with the infantry tank, Churchill. Now, the British, they had infantry tanks. They also had light tanks for a time, but by World War II, they'd almost totally abandoned the whole light tank, not just in concept, but even in service. Instead, they went to the cruiser tank. And in a way, they still use them today. So we're going to talk about the beginning of the cruiser tank in a few different videos. We're going to look at the Crusader, the Centaur, Cromwell, even the Comet and beyond. But yeah, today's video is going to be on the early days between Vickers and Nuffield and the whole Crusader North Africa campaign series. So let's get into it. Unfortunately, this video is going to be a lot of me talking and looking at this one model. And I don't even actually remember who it's from. It's either Atlas, Altea, or D'Agostini. They all use the same tooling. I kind of like these. They're a 1/72 scale diecast, and the quality is quite nice. Better than Eagle Moss or a Mercum, but more affordable than, say, Hobby Master. You do get a rotating turret and even a moving gun, and you do have rubber tracks, and you can dismount it from the plinth if you need to. But yeah, the Crusader here pretty much is known for the North African campaign. That's where it saw use. But the whole cruiser concept goes back to the mid-30s, where Vickers started off. Kind of began with the A7 concept, which led to the A9, which was ordered about 125, I believe, and adopted as the tank cruiser Mark I. This would lead to a slightly heavier version, the A10 tank cruiser Mark II. I believe they had about 170, 175 of those. Keep in mind this is interwar period. Of course, then they go to the A11 and A12, which are the Matildas. And then we get them to the A13, which is kind of the next cruiser, which would lead to the Mark III cruiser. This is where it gets a little interesting. Vickers had kind of been leading the way, and we had tanks that were, 14, 15, 16 tons. By this point, they're wanting something more heavily armed and armored, and they're projecting 18 tons. And they want it to have a reasonably high top speed. Say 30 miles per hour, maybe 25. And you start to have a couple of companies with one known as LMS taking the lead, and you would have the Mark V Covenanter, which would go into production actually in pretty large numbers, but never combat service. It was kind of a meh. It used a new engine design. Didn't work out great. I believe it either had the 2-pounder or could have had the 6-pounder gun later on. But around 1938, Nuffield was working on a few designs like the A14 and the A16 to be bigger, what they called a heavy cruiser tank. In 1939, this would lead the government to offer them a contract to build the Covenanter under license, and instead of building a copy of it, they said, well, we can do better. So they had a parallel but alternative design to the Covenanter, which would become the cruiser here, known as the A15. It used the traditional Liberty engine, had a little bit different suspension, different radiator system, different tracks a little bit, but it did use essentially the same turret and gun as the Covenanter. And it was ordered as well because the Brits needed all the tanks they could get in 1939, 1940, and it became the tank cruiser Mark VI, or the Crusader Mark I initially. And that's what we Well, this isn't a Mark I, this is a Mark II, but they're quite similar. But the first one was ready in 1940. Ironically, even though the Covenanter was ordered before the Crusader, the first Crusader was ready over a month before the first Covenanter. Now, because of wartime, they didn't really order prototyping and testing. They just ordered into production. So I hate to say the first prototype or mild steel model. It was really just the first one off the production line, but of course it was used for testing. So yeah, that would happen in 1940 for the Crusader Mark I, and then soon the Covenanter Mark I. So, what do we have here? Well, we're not quite 21 feet long. We're a little bit heavier than they projected. Initially about 19 tons, later it would grow to just under 20 tons. And the Mark I and Mark II here, adopted as, like I said, the cruiser. These are very confusing. Mark VI and Mark II of this would be adopted as the Cruiser Mark VI-A. They would have the quick fire, the QF Ordnance 2-pounder gun, good anti-tank gun. The Mark I would have about 40 millimeter of armor. The Mark II would up this to about 50 millimeter at its maximum. We have an interesting turret shape. It kind of flares out and dips in. This is to give more room. Looks cool, but it was a little more convoluted to produce, and at certain angles it would act as a bullet trap. So we have the gun in here. For the 2-pounder, it had about 110 rounds on board. Could have a radio. It also could have a ball mount for a 7.9 millimeter MK.VI machine gun in the hull, but often this was removed along with the driver or the guy that would sit there because it was very cramped. We have, of course, a second coaxially mounted MK.VI machine gun. The Brits felt that any tank had to have a coaxial mounted machine gun. We have the Liberty engine in the back. This one has a fuel tank. These side skirts. This, like I said, this is a Mark II, so it does have the added armor. We have a crew of anywhere from 3 to 5, depending on the version. If you have the hull machine gun and it's a Mark I or Mark II, it's 5. If you don't have the hull machine gun, it's 4. Driver, commander, gunner, loader. Later, the Mark III would reduce this to 3 men. Talk about that in a minute. And, yeah, cruiser. The armor isn't the worst thing ever at 40 to 50 millimeters, but it's not great. The 2-pounder gun is a good anti-tank gun, but it doesn't really have any high explosive shells to talk about. Even though they made one, they didn't really issue it much, and if they did, it was tiny. It was a little firecracker, so it wasn't really worth it. It did carry nearly 5,000 rounds of 7.9 millimeter for the machine guns, though. There's that. And it was reasonably fast, although by this point, with the extra weight, you're looking at about 26, maybe 27 miles per hour on a good road. So a little bit slower than I'd hoped for, and that reduces down to about 15 miles per hour cross-country. But keep in mind, that's the max speed of a Churchill, so an on-road. So it is faster. And these are also very maneuverable. They've got good turning, good cornering, and, at 19 tons, verging on 20, as we add a larger gun and armor, it's still quite a bit lighter than what else is out there. Trying to be, fair about this. What else? I mean, it's a tank. It does tank things. And, of course, it was rushed into production. And in some ways, it would show. And it would also be rushed into combat. North Africa was one of the earliest proving grounds for, the Second World War. The Brits initially went up against the Italians But in 1941, early in the year, Rommel came in force with the Germans, and so they had to contend with both. But of course, even though the Crusader had its problems, the German tanks in early 41 weren't the Panthers and Tigers and even Panzer IIIs and IVs we would later know. They had their own issues too, and the desert was hard on everyone. But the Crusader, it didn't do great. By 1940, it was in production, and they started to get these shipped over in 1941, but they had a lot of problems. I was almost like, what didn't go wrong? Quality control in the factory was kind of because wartime and a lot of the experienced workers were gone or working on other projects, so quality was meh. When the tanks got there, they didn't have enough spare parts, or sometimes any spare parts. They didn't even have enough tools to work on the tanks. It was so bad that as tanks wore out or were damaged, they had to scavenge parts, which themselves were worn, from other tanks instead of brand new replacement parts, and the desert was hard on them. They also discovered that the Liberty engine liked to overheat in the desert. The cooling system wasn't adequate, and it needed water, and guess what there's not a lot of in the desert? Yeah, so the cooling system was not sufficient to begin with, and was only made worse because not enough water. Yeah, the desert took its toll. Now at this time, the 2-pounder gun, which was about a 40 millimeter gun, but relatively high velocity, was still adequate. And it's kind of interesting how the stabilization system works in this. And by stabilization system, I mean the gunner. He essentially just mounted the gun kind of using a harness or framework around his body and just manually aimed it. But the gun was light enough that he could do that. Of course, later guns, not so much. But yeah. Like I said, we originally had up to a 5-man crew, but this was quickly reduced to 4 because they would usually remove the machine gun mount, or mini turret, if you will, in the hull. It saved a little weight, saved a crew member, so less resources, and it wasn't terribly useful anyway. It was very cramped and didn't have the best firing arc. And yeah, made sense. So they would go from the Mark I to the Mark II. They would add some armor. They would also give the ammunition stowage boxes more armor. That reduced ammo down to about 100 rounds, but it meant the tank didn't blow up as readily, so that was good. Basically, it wasn't an unmitigated disaster when it went into service, but it was a disaster. They started shipping these over. They really wanted to get them in service by May of 1941, but it wouldn't be until June that they had their first combat. This would be to try to break the siege of Tobruk, and they would lose about a dozen of these because, well, Rommel was there, and the Germans had learned how to kind of play on the Brits, and they ambushed them, and it didn't go great. On the other hand, the Crusader did use its maneuverability, and it was the primary cruiser tank for the Brits at this time. Now, they would use some M3 Stuarts from the USA for like reconnaissance tanks, because they were even smaller and lighter than these. But we didn't have a lot of other options at this time in the theater. Of course, for the infantry tank, the Matilda was there, and soon the Valentine would be there. And there were the older cruisers, Mark I, II, III. Now the Mark V, the Covenanter, it was actually behind this one in development, and it never left England. It didn't really do great, so it was never there. So I guess compared to the Covenanter, the Crusader was fantastic. They continued to deliver these throughout 1941, again going to the improved version, and yeah, it would continue to see combat throughout that year, doing well against Italian tanks, and at this time holding its own, at least in terms of guns and armor, against the Panzers of the day. Towards the end of the year, in what was known as Operation Crusader, no relation, These were quite instrumental and useful. And as we rolled into 1942, we did start to see more American tanks coming in, namely M3s, be it Lees or Grants. They're the same, just minor variation. And so that took some pressure off the Crusaders. Also, around the same time, you started to see the Crusader Mark III. And this is the upgunned version with the new quick-fire 6-pounder. And they'd been working on this gun and mount and everything on and off throughout 1941, but they didn't really get serious towards the end of the year. And they started to roll the Mark IIIs off the production line in May, and they first saw combat during the Second Battle of El Alamein in October of 1942. They had about 100 of them available. Now, the 6-pounder, of course, was about a 57mm gun and had better armor penetration, which is good because by this time, German armor really could resist most 2-pounder shots unless they were close range or lucky. So you start to see the Mark IIIs replacing the older Mark I and Mark IIs, but you also start to see more and more American tanks and other British tanks kind of phasing these in. So that after El Alamein, these are pretty much used for reconnaissance and flanking and specialized groups. I believe the Aussies had some as well. And Montgomery, once he took over, he was really a big fan of the M3s and pushed for the Sherman to come in, the M4. And once those started to be delivered, that was pretty much it for the Crusader in Egypt and that region. Now, these would be used in Tunisia when the Brits would go in November of 1942. And there, in that environment, because it was more small-scale engagements with maneuverability and more flat surfaces and whatnot, the Crusader here did do better and was used in more small unit engagements throughout the end of that year and into 1943. But that was kind of the last gasp. The tank here never really went outside of North African region, and that year production would be halted in favor of newer designs. But they did build 5,300 of these. That's pretty damn impressive for a 3-year run during wartime. And they also had what they called a close support version, which was armed with a 3-inch howitzer, about a 76mm gun in the turret, instead of the 2 or the 6-pounder. But that was about as big as they could do. They were already pretty cramped in here. And that's actually why the turret went from a 3-man turret down to a 2 with the Mark III. There was just not room for the loader, so the commander had to do loading duties. It wasn't ideal, but it's the space they had to work with. But since we're using the old Liberty engine, and since this is already a little bit slow for a cruiser, especially by the time we get to the Mark III, which is just about 20 tons, there wasn't much more they could do with it. It was at the kind of the end of its design life, I guess you would say. And that is Nuffield's Crusader, the Cruiser Mark VI. Next time we'll get to the 7 and beyond. And yes, I know there are Star Trek models over there. What can I do? But after North Africa, these were kind of sent to the home front. They were used there to protect the, home reservist. Some were converted into tractors. A few were converted into anti-aircraft. But that was pretty much it. And they were formally retired in 1945 at the end of the war. But it is the cruiser concept, and I believe it was the first, the Mark III was which this is a Mark II, but I believe the Mark III was the first tank to actually field the QF 6-pounder gun. Could be wrong in that, but I believe that's the case. I don't think that was intended, but it's just, how reality worked out. It had its things. it was a good enough tank. I mean, it had its moments in North Africa and was very heavily relied on when they had nothing else. It's better than throwing rocks from a horse-driven chariot, right? Also known as the Covenanter. That was pretty much not a good tank. But anyway, yeah, next time we will talk about the Centaur and the Cromwell. This is Misha, and I will catch you then.